Welcome to Module 4 of the Non-Residential Lighting Controls video series. In this module, we'll focus on shutoff controls. Shutoff controls automatically shut off or reduce light output when a space is vacant or normally unoccupied. In this module, we'll learn about time switch lighting controls, occupancy and vacancy sensing controls. We'll review when and where these controls are required, and also discuss prescriptive requirements related to these types of controls. Finally, we'll discuss the compliance process. Let's begin with an overview of shutoff controls. Shutoff controls automatically shut off or reduce light output when a space is vacant or normally unoccupied. They're required for nearly all non-residential lighting systems in newly constructed buildings, additions, and alterations. Shutoff controls include time-based control and occupancy-based control. First, there are time switch lighting controls. Time switch controls allow for scheduling of lighting system operation based on occupant schedule, day of the week, and time. For example, a time switch control can be programmed to automatically turn lighting on in the morning before people arrive for work, and automatically turn lighting off after they leave work. Time-based controls include automatic time switch controls, astronomical time switch controls, multi-level astronomical time switch controls, and outdoor astronomical time switch controls. Astronomical time switch controls allow you to customize lighting operation schedules based on geographic location and time of the year. Then there are occupancy-based controls. These include occupant sensors, motion sensors, vacancy sensors, partial on sensors, and partial off sensors. Occupancy sensors are used for indoor spaces, motion sensors in outdoor spaces. Vacancy sensors automatically turn lighting off after an area is vacated, but requires lights to be turned on manually. Partial on sensors turn only a portion of the lights on when occupancy is detected and turn all the lights off when the space becomes vacant. On the other hand, partial off sensors turn only a portion of the lights off when a space becomes vacant. The sensor may automatically turn this same portion back on, or the system may be set so that manual on control is required. Now, let's examine the mandatory requirements for automatic shutoff controls contained in Section 130.1c of the Energy Standards. Let's go over some general shutoff controls requirements contained in the 2016 Energy Standards. In addition to area controls and multi-level lighting controls, which we learned about in Modules 2 and 3 of this video series, all installed indoor lighting must be equipped with shutoff controls that meet the following requirements. The lighting system must be controlled by an occupant sensing control, automatic time switch control, or other control capable of automatically shutting off all of the lighting when the space is typically unoccupied. Additionally, there must be separate shutoff controls for the lighting on each floor, other than lighting in stairwells. For larger enclosed spaces, you must have a separate control for each 5,000 square feet of floor area. There are exceptions. In malls, auditoriums, single-tenant retail, industrial, convention centers, and arenas, the control zone can be as large as 20,000 square feet. Finally, general display, ornamental, and display case lighting must be controlled separately. As with the other lighting controls requirements we've discussed, there are a few general exceptions to the shutoff lighting controls requirements. If the lighting is serving an area that is in continuous use 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, the shutoff control requirements of Section 130.1c(1) are not applicable. Certain spaces are exempt from the shutoff requirements of Section 130.1c(1) if they comply with the requirements in Section 130.1c(5) or Section 130.1c(7). Up to 0.1 watts per square foot of lighting in any area within a building may be continuously illuminated if it's designated for means of egress. Lighting in electrical equipment rooms subject to Article 110.26 of the California Electrical Code is also exempt. And lastly, any illumination provided by lighting equipment that is designed as emergency lighting, is connected to an emergency power source or battery supply, and is intended to function in emergency mode only when normal power is absent, is exempt from shutoff control requirements. One type of common shutoff control is a countdown timer switch. Under the energy standards, these devices can only be used in a limited number of cases. Generally, they cannot be used to comply with the standards. Let's take a look at where and when they can be used. Countdown timer switches can be used in single-stall bathrooms and closets less than 70 square feet in size. The maximum timeout setting must be 10 minutes or less to comply with the automatic shutoff requirements. These devices can also be used in server aisles and dedicated server rooms. In these spaces, the maximum timeout setting must be 30 minutes or less. When an automatic time switch control is used to comply with the automatic shutoff requirements, the control is not responsive to the presence or absence of occupants. Therefore, the automatic time switch control must incorporate an override so occupants can still use the lighting. The override control must allow the lighting to remain on for no more than 2 hours when an override is initiated. However, there are exceptions to the override time limit. In the following function areas, if a captive key override is utilized, the override time may exceed 2 hours. Malls, auditoriums, single-tenant retail, industrial, and arenas. Automatic time switch controls must also incorporate an automatic holiday shutoff feature that turns all the lighting loads off for at least 24 hours and then resumes the normally scheduled operation. However, this feature is not required for retail stores, restaurants, grocery stores, churches, and theaters. Under the energy standards, occupancy sensors are required to shut off all the lighting in certain types of spaces. We'll review these requirements now. The energy standards require occupancy sensors to shut off all the lighting in offices 250 square feet or smaller, multi-purpose rooms of less than 1,000 square feet, classrooms of any size, and conference rooms of any size. If the lighting in these areas is required by Section 130.1b to have multi-level lighting controls, the occupant sensing controls must function either as a partial on device or a vacancy sensor. Partial on occupant sensors must be capable of automatically activating between 50 and 70% of the controlled lighting when an occupant is detected. When using a vacancy sensor, all the lighting must be manually turned on by the occupant. If the lighting in these areas is not required to have multi-level lighting controls, the occupant sensing controls must function either as a standard occupant sensor, a partial on occupant sensor, or a vacancy sensor. A standard occupancy sensor automatically turns all the lights on when a space is occupied and off when it's vacant. In addition, regardless of the occupancy control type, manual controls must always be available to occupants. Now let's go over the areas where full or partial off occupant sensing controls are required. First, this control strategy is required for aisleways and open areas and warehouses. Lighting should be independently controlled, and occupancy controls must automatically reduce lighting power by 50 to 100% when the area is vacant. It's important to note that full off occupancy sensors can be used to satisfy the control requirements for these spaces. Also, occupancy control should not control lighting beyond the aisleway. There are exceptions. If the aisleways and open areas and warehouses have a lighting power of 80% or less of that allowed under the area category method, then occupant sensing controls can reduce the lighting power by as little as 40%. Spaces with reduced lighting power as compared to the maximum allowed by the standards are already saving significant amounts of energy. Therefore, less dimming is needed to achieve the energy savings goals intended by the standards. Plus, in these areas, elevated dimming may drop light levels too low for the space. Also, if metal halide lighting or high-pressure sodium lighting is installed in warehouses, occupant sensing controls can reduce lighting power by 40%. This exception is in place to account for the fact that metal halide lighting is difficult to dim past 50% of full output. Lighting in library book stack aisles 10 feet or longer that are accessible from only one end, and library book stack aisles 20 feet or longer that are accessible from both ends, must also be controlled by full or partial off occupancy controls. The controls must automatically reduce lighting power by at least 50 to 100% when the areas are unoccupied. As with warehouses, the occupant sensing controls must independently control lighting in each aisleway and must not control lighting beyond the aisleway being controlled by the sensor. The last area that requires full or partial off occupancy control is corridors and stairwells. Lighting must also be controlled by occupant sensing controls that separately reduce the lighting power in each space by at least 50 to 100% when the space is unoccupied. The occupant sensing controls must be capable of automatically turning the lighting fully on only in the separately controlled space and must be automatically activated from all designated paths of egress. It is important to note that Section 130.1c6 is in addition to Section 130.1c1. A partial off occupancy sensor would satisfy Section 130.1c6. However, you will still need either a full off occupancy sensor or time clock to satisfy Section 130.1c1 to shut off lighting when the space is normally unoccupied. We've reached the last part of this module where we learn about the areas where partial off occupant sensing controls are required. Lighting installed in the following areas must use partial off occupancy controls. Lighting in stairwells and common area corridors that provide access to guest rooms and dwelling units of high-rise residential buildings and hotels or motels. Lighting in these spaces must be controlled with occupant sensing controls that automatically reduce lighting power by at least 50 to 100% when the areas are unoccupied. The occupant sensing controls must be capable of automatically turning the lighting fully on only in the separately controlled space and must be automatically activated from all design paths of egress. You are not required to turn lighting fully off in these spaces. Just like other types of occupancy controls, there are exceptions. In corridors and stairwells, in which the installed lighting power is 80% or less of the value allowed under the area category method, occupant sensing controls must reduce power by a minimum of 40%. Again, these spaces are already using less electricity for lighting than is allowed by the standards. Dimming requirements can be relaxed. Partial off controls are also required in parking garages. In parking garages, parking areas, and loading and unloading areas, general lighting must be controlled by occupant sensing controls having at least one control step between 20% and 50% of design lighting power. It's important to note that to comply with this requirement, full off occupancy sensing controls are not allowed. In these spaces, no more than 500 watts of rated lighting power can be controlled together as a single zone. A reasonably uniform level of illuminance must also be achieved in accordance with the applicable requirements in Table 130.1-A. In addition, the occupant sensing controls must be capable of automatically turning the lighting fully on only in the separately controlled space and must be automatically activated from all designated paths of egress. Interior areas of parking garages are classified as indoor lighting for compliance with the standards. Parking areas on the roof of a parking structure are classified as outdoor hardscape and must comply with the applicable provisions in Section 130.2. We'll talk more about outdoor lighting control requirements in Module 7 of this video series. Metal halide luminaires with a lamp plus ballast mean system efficacy of greater than 75 lumens per watt, used for general lighting in parking garages, parking areas, and loading and unloading areas, must be controlled by partial off occupant sensing controls. With this type of lighting, the occupancy controls must provide at least one control step between 20% and 60% of design lighting power. Hotel and motel guest rooms must have captive card key controls, occupancy sensing controls, or automatic controls such that no longer than 30 minutes after the guest room has been vacated, lighting power is switched off. There is an exception to this requirement for one luminaire. The luminaire must be high efficacy as defined in Table 150.0-A. It must be switched separately, and the switch must be located within 6 feet of the entry door. In addition to the mandatory requirements for shutoff controls that we have discussed, there are several prescriptive requirements related to the devices. First, certain types of lighting are excluded from lighting power density calculations under the prescriptive compliance approach. This means for these applications, lighting systems can use as much power as is needed for the task. One of these exceptions is dependent on the use of a vacancy sensor. Lighting intended for hair, makeup, and costume preparation in performing arts facility dressing rooms is excluded for lighting power density calculations if it's separately switched from the general lighting and is controlled by a vacancy sensor. Second, the use of occupancy sensors in large open plan offices qualifies for a PAF if certain requirements are met. Under the prescriptive compliance approach, as we have discussed in other videos in this series, voluntary use of certain lighting controls that go beyond mandatory requirements can give designers and building owners some flexibility to install additional lighting in a space. In large open plan offices, the use of occupancy sensors for general lighting above workstations is one such case. To qualify for this PAF, occupancy sensors must be installed in an open plan office area greater than 250 square feet, be installed in an open plan office area that contains workstations, control only the general lighting or certain types of furniture mounted luminaires defined under section 140.6A of the Energy Standards, and be installed and configured in such a way that they are not triggered by movement outside the controlled area. When all these conditions are met, the system qualifies for a PAF between 0.2 and 0.4, depending on the size of the occupancy sensor control zone. Details are provided in Table 140.6-A of the Energy Standards. Now let's discuss the documentation necessary in order to comply with those energy standards. All types of shutoff controls must be documented on certificates of compliance, installation, and acceptance when used to comply with the energy standards. Form NRCC-LTI-01-E is required for all buildings. This is the Certificate of Compliance for indoor lighting. NRCC-LTI-02-E is used to document lighting controls installed to comply with the standards. Shutoff controls must be noted in Table A and listed separately in Table B for both mandatory devices and occupancy sensors qualifying for a PAF. Following installation, compliance is documented on Certificate of Installation NRCI-LTI-01-E. Details on installed shutoff controls must be provided on this form. In addition, if occupancy sensors are installed to qualify for a PAF, Certificate of Installation NRCI-LTI-05-E is required. The responsible party must certify that the occupancy sensors are properly installed and meet all the requirements of the PAF. Acceptance testing is required for all types of shutoff controls. Acceptance test results are documented on compliance form NRCA-LTI-02-A. However, if controls are installed to control 20 or fewer luminaires for the entire project, acceptance testing is not required. Before we end this module, let's review what we've learned. We've learned that there are two general types of shutoff controls: automatic time switch controls and occupancy controls. Shutoff controls are mandatory in all new buildings, building additions, and alterations, with a few exceptions. Occupancy sensors are required in several types of spaces. Their functionality is dependent on the space where they are installed. Some must act as a full off device, others as a partial off, partial on, or vacancy sensor. Under the prescriptive compliance approach, in large open plan offices, use of occupancy sensors can qualify for a PAF. All shutoff controls must undergo and pass acceptance test to comply with the energy standards. This concludes Module 4. For more information on non-residential lighting controls, please visit the Energy Commission website at energy.ca.gov/Title 24/2016 standards.